Hi, I'm Othais, and this, well, actually, I never did turn up a proper name, a consistent official name for this revolver, but collectors tend to call this the Colt 1878-1902, the Philippine double-action army, or, long ago and incorrectly, the Alaskan model. But we'll clear all that up over the course of this particular episode. Before that, Lightbox. Being for the military, the 1902 is standardized, unlike last episode, so we have an overall length of just under 11 inches thanks to a new 6-inch barrel. The weight has snuck up by about 1/10 of a pound, and the trigger pulled by several dozen. Good thing it's so long. The cylinder is still a 6-shot, chambering the .45 Colt cartridge, loading and unloading singularly through the side gate. As you enjoy this episode, please take a moment to think to yourself, would I like another episode next time? If the answer is yes, please thank the patrons for making it possible, or perhaps join them. Today's Revolver was brought to you by striving for the impossible. It sounds poetic, sure, but when government officials are involved, this kind of thing is inevitable. Now, over the past 2 episodes, we've run down a lot of history. Colt's first double-action revolver, the small-bore medium-frame Colt 1877, which actually proved to be a very popular seller in the commercial personal protection market. Focusing on martial use, the 1878 Colt double-action Army used a similar mechanism nested into a single-piece frame, much larger, heavier, and chambering a variety of powerful handgun cartridges. This gun was meant to meet every possible expectation of a then-modern military force. Last episode, we learned that both England and Canada would purchase the 78. However, both of those were emergency purchases made possible by simply having inventory on hand when times were tough. Neither went through much of a vetting process, and certainly no trials. Colt's single-action Army in .45 Colt was at the same time standard issue for the US government. As far as anyone knew, they were perfectly happy with it, but of course, better to head off the competition before they make a move. One of the earliest double-action Army revolvers to be produced was presented to then-Captain Othais and Mae, Chief Ordnance Officer of the Department of Dakota. Michaelis found the new double action to be exceptional. He would write, "All who have seen it pronounce it the best revolver yet made," and stating, "I have asked for 100 to be issued to cavalry companies for trials. The Colt's has been made the weapon of the 7th Cavalry by a regimental order." This was of course 2 years after Little Bighorn. Michaelis' request would be partially heeded. Instead of 100 revolvers though, Colonel James G. Benton of Springfield Armory would request a single sample in August of 1878. So far, I don't know of any reports or documentation about how the ordnance officials felt about that particular gun. However, they did order another single example in October of 1879. Now they had 2. This time we do have Colonel Benton's thoughts. They aren't great. He felt that the only advantage was that the new model could be fired rapidly without disturbing one's aim. That's frankly a hell of a lot of gain, but the disadvantages, well, light strikes on the cartridges and a liability to accidentally discharge. Now, light strikes, often called misfires at the time, will be a recurring theme in today's episode. That accidental discharge though, we heard that one from the British as well in our previous episode. Once again, unless I'm missing something about the early examples of this gun, I don't see a way to achieve what we would call a truly accidental discharge in our modern context, meaning a failure of the mechanism causing the gun to fire. Instead, it seems that they meant negligent discharge, user error, meaning messing around with the trigger when you weren't actually pointed on target. Even so, Benton blamed the gun. The reason for the accidental discharges will be apparent to anyone who examines the arm. While experimenting with one of the 2 pistols sent to this armory by General Franklin, one of them was fired prematurely, although the person handling it was careful and experienced. He was unable to state the precise cause of the accident. The Army was uninterested, and to my knowledge, there was no further consideration of the 1878. The Navy, however, did take some mild interest, especially in double-action revolvers as a whole. Then Captain Montgomery Sicard, Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance for the Navy, would in August of 1886 send out letters to various arms companies, requesting they submit .38 caliber double-action revolvers for consideration towards adoption. Colt would send 2 examples, an 1877 and an 1878, both in .38 long Colt. Neither would apparently impress. The lack of Navy interest might have been influenced by a certain friend of ours from previous episodes, Frederick von Oppen, who apparently had been writing back and forth with Navy Commander William Folger in 1885. He apparently told him, "In England and the continent, single-action revolvers are looked upon as interesting relics of a former civilization. Nothing in larger pistols is now asked for but simultaneous extractors, double action with rebounding locks." Notably, the Navy would go on to adopt the Colt 1889, a swing-out cylinder, simultaneous ejecting single and double-action revolver of .38 caliber. Honestly, I tend to agree with history on this one. The 1878, as was at its very release, is already a little obsolete and overly complicated. Why? Well, let me actually give you an example. Here is our Colt model 1878. That's because it was released in, you guessed it, 1878. Now, this revolver that I have here is a Swiss 1882, which was not released in 1878. However, it is descended from a revolver that was, which has the same rebounding hammer, and it includes an Abadie loading system that was also available in 1878 thanks to the Abadie revolver. Now, did some gun have all these features? No, but the features entered the market at the exact same time that this guy entered the market. So what am I talking about? Well, ignore the fact that she's small bore, but this gun has single, cock, and double with a very heavy trigger, if I'm honest, boom action. Now, if we go ahead and fire the gun, let me see, boom and release, watch what happens to the hammer. That's auto rebounding, no manual rebound, always safe to manipulate the cylinder in this particular gun, and a very simple construction to do that, although we're not covering it as part of this episode today. The other advantage of this pistol is that we have an Abadie gate system, which automatically makes sure that our hammer is back and locked and allows us to simply pull the trigger in order to load or eject a round. Pull, eject. This is a speed loading and unloading system. Now, of course, this isn't as good as, say, simultaneous eject, but it's getting there, and it's available again in the same year. Even disregarding what was available at the time, we also have in 1880 the introduction of the Enfield Mark I. This is Britain's first official 4.76, let's call it a top break revolver, although we have a very unusual ejection system. The point being, for our case today, because we're not going into too much detail yet, is that this is simultaneous ejecting. It still actually loads through a gate, but that's all right, because now our man Oppen is obsessed with rebounding hammers and simultaneous ejection, and for good reason, because that's what the British market's going to want if it's the minimum. Perhaps more importantly, the double-action army was expensive, ranging from $18 to $20, when the single-action army hovered around $11 or $12. Realistically, Colt had played a game of catch-up on this particular gun. Yeah, it's cool, and it's also just a little too late. And it was dumped into a market already piled high with very insensitive .45 Colt ammunition, which means that over the years, Colts and others would start to produce more double-action friendly cartridges. But that takes time in order to accomplish, and all the while, various inventories carry the old ammo, meaning the .78 could be a risky choice for adoption. Further innovation might have been stifled by William Mason leaving Colts in 1882, having been poached by Winchester Repeating Arms. VP Franklin would also leave Colts, taking a position at Hartford Steam and Boiler Inspection and Insurance Company in 1888, though he did remain on the board of directors until 1901. Which was the same year that Elizabeth Colt decided to sell the company to an investment group organized under Armstrong and Shermer, with John Hall at the helm. All that said, there was still some curiosity around the double-action army. For example, this 1884 patent from Carl Ebbets presents a double-action only variation of the .78. Given the already weak sales and skepticism, I doubt it went far into prototyping. Further blows for the double action came with the aforementioned naval adoption of the Colt 1889 and the Army following in 1892. In 1898, Colts also introduced a swing-out cylinder single and double action big bore new service model, which effectively replaced the .78 in the market. However, the new service took some time to catch on, so a trickle of annual sales continued until 1902, which is when they sort of fell off the cliff, with only about 600 or so of these guys being sold commercially that year. For perspective, that same year saw 13,000 of the new 38 swingouts and 10,000 of the old 1877 38s and 41s. They were still popular. And yet, I have this gun. Why? Well, for that we have to do a bit of remembering. Having fought a very successful war with Spain, the US walked away with a good deal on some colonial territories, one of which was the Philippine Islands. Now at first, the various peoples of the Philippines were pretty happy about this. They got rid of the Spanish, but you guys happen to know the difference between a Yankee and a damned Yankee, right? Well, a regular Yankee comes, stays for a bit, and then he goes home. Soon, the Philippine insurrection against Spain was being directed at the occupying US forces, meaning men, material, and munitions would be needed to secure the new US territory. Now, the conflict in the Philippines came in stages. The first lasted about 3 years, meaning that by the middle of 1901, things were, well, they weren't necessarily open warfare anymore. The first civilian governor of the Philippines would be appointed in 1900, William Taft, who at this point had been a newspaper writer, lawyer, and judge. In 1890, he was appointed Solicitor General of the United States. Then in 1892, he became a federal judge and began teaching at the Cincinnati Law School. In 1900, he was invited by William McKinley to organize the civilian government of the Philippine Islands. Technically under Taft was the military governor general Adna Chaffee, although his role is less direct in our story today. I introduce him as a reminder that there will be two factions of leadership at play in the Philippines at this time. The shared goal of the military and civilian authorities was the shepherding of the islands into a stable commonwealth. For the army, that meant the ability to withdraw costly mass troops and disentangle themselves from a now more nuanced policing action. Fun fact, the Philippine Islands were home to a diverse number of peoples, villages, and geographic boundaries and challenges. That meant policing concerns could vary widely. Fugitives could effectively disappear without a trace, and guerrillas were indistinguishable from the peaceful populace, or, oftentimes, from the police officers themselves. The solution for this was a tiered system of authority and response. At the bottom were the village police, usually native Filipinos, poorly equipped and loosely trained. It was not uncommon for village police to repeatedly switch sides. Miss a payday, stop checking in often enough, and they might just switch to banditry, especially in the early days. The village police might be lightly armed with bludgeons or, especially early on, captured Spanish equipment, like the single-shot rolling block rifle. However, they were not trusted with much in the way of ammunition, as it was exceedingly common to find those same stores in the hands of the guerrillas a few weeks later. Over top of the village police were the Philippine Constabulary. This force was again primarily made up of Filipinos, often Tagalog. The officers were, again early on, mostly Americans, usually Army officers and NCOs from volunteer units. However, the Constabulary put an emphasis on recruiting and training Philippine officers, quickly making it a mixed force with an emphasis on local solutions. If the local police were overwhelmed, or went rogue for that matter, the Constabulary would be called in to restore order, usually by disarming everyone in sight and then settling any outstanding debts. The Constabulary would also fill in for the Army in remote regions, guarding jails, telegraph lines, and postal routes. If the Constabulary was overwhelmed, the Philippine Scouts would be called in. Often confused with the Constabulary, these were under the aegis of the US Army. While they had Filipino troops, the officers were American only. It was a segregated force. If the Scouts were overwhelmed, then the Army proper would be called in. So, when we talk about the Constabulary, know that we mean a mixed force above the village police but below the Army Scouts. Adding further confusion, there were also better trained municipal police who seem to have been treated roughly on the same order as the Constabulary, though they were pretty much limited to Manila and, say, Cebu City. The Constabulary was founded in July of 1901. with the first chief thereof being then Major Henry Turman Allen, who had successfully officered the Philippine Scouts in Leyte against insurgent forces, earning a reputation for being fair and respectful of the laws of war. Constabulary units were assigned to each province and put under the direction of the local provincial governors, many of whom had previously been the local insurgent leaders, which is one of several reasons why Governor William Taft was having trouble arming them. In an October of 1901 report, he is quoted as saying, "The insufficiency of arms will unquestionably limit the efficiency of the force," ordering all of the then standard arms available to the nascent constabulary to be turned over to his control. The bulk of these were Colt single-action army revolvers, these being the shortened artillery model. These were, by the way, not made for Philippine service, but were requested by General Flagler way back in 1894, before the Spanish-American War. Long arms were mostly single-shot 12-gauge Remington No. 3 shotguns, purchased specifically for arming locals. Both of these arms provided a strong measure of immediate knockdown power. The Colt single actions were just the luck of having so many in stock as outdated equipment, since the Army was now on the 38, although the smaller caliber was proving unpopular, especially in the Philippines, for the same reason that the shotguns had been purchased. The most feared opponent of a peacekeeper on the islands was the juramentado, men who had sworn a death oath, shaved, prayed, been blessed by a priest, dressed in white. They would bind their bodies tightly to resist blood loss and shock, then go on a one-way killing spree with whatever weapon they could manage, usually a large knife, but sometimes firearms. However, the juramentado was a long-standing and nuanced cultural practice which could emerge from jihad, personal revenge, or even being bought out, settling deep family debts to powerful men. They were a rare problem, but a terrifying one. More often, the constabulary was faced with plain old bandits and rebels. When properly armed, again usually with old Spanish equipment, these battles could look like the war all over again. But more often than not, they lacked arms or ammunition and had to fight with the available bladed or blunt weapons. That meant disguising as ordinary folk, lying in wait, and then jumping out at officers at close range. Again, a reason to want a hard-hitting, instantaneous solution. Taft's first request for more arms included 1,372 Krag-Jorgensen carbines. He specifically wanted carbines due to the shorter and lighter stature of the native Philippine troops. The problem was, this was the same rifle and ammunition as the US Army. Recall, the village police were unreliable, and the constabulary were just above them, so still had a habit of wandering off with equipment sometimes. Any potential pathway for native rebels to get a hold of standard 30-40 ammunition wasn't going to go over well with Army officials, so they fought Taft's request, ultimately forcing him to settle for the aging Springfield trapdoor carbines. These did not, however, solve the shortage of handguns. Chaffee's solution was that they acquire new 45 caliber revolvers. The 38 was Army standard, same problem as the Krag, but also the 45 was felt to be more effective anyway. Probably most importantly, there was a surplus of ammunition on hand from the Army's obsolete supplies. In August of 1901, Taft would put out a request through the U.S. Ordnance Department for the acquisition of 5,000 more Remington shotguns, 250,000 brass 12-gauge shells, and 5,000 Colt revolvers caliber 45, 6-inch barrel, double-action latest model. Okay, definitely the new service model then, rounded butt with sling. Mother of God, he means the 1878. Oh, and 250,000 rounds of 45 Colt. I am really unsure if this was a cost calculation or if Taft simply had no idea about the introduction of the Colt new service revolver. It also appears that no one corrected him. Instead, the wheels just started turning. On the largest contract for Colt 1878 revolvers ever. Ordnance passed the order to Colts, and they sent along a contract sample in September of 1901. This was received and inspected by Captain Otis Creamer Horney at the Springfield Armory. As a matter of fact, a very small number of pre-production Philippine model revolvers will have his initials instead of the usual RAC. More on those in a moment. Even as this revolver was being prodded, a contract was signed for 5,000 units. Everything was going smoothly until Captain Horney pointed out something dire. The new revolver was not capable of reliably discharging the older style 45 Colt cartridges presently available in Army surplus inventory. These rounds had been tailored to the single-action Army, a pistol with a heavy striking hammer, which meant the primers could be very insensitive. As a matter of fact, they probably were made insensitive as a safety measure. Only a deliberate blow would set them off, and every single action hammer drop was very deliberate. Othais reported that new, special ammunition would be necessary for this sidearm. Now, at this time, Springfield Armory was being commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Frank Phipps, who passed word along to the acting chief of ordnance. I'm actually unsure who was acting at the time or why there was an acting one. Anyway, the official chief of ordnance was Adelbert Rinaldo Buffington, who would later on in the letter writing back up the acting chief's order, which is that the Colt's revolvers would have to be made such that they could reliably discharge the 45 Colt cartridges in surplus. Captain Horney kindly pointed out that making the hammer fall heavy enough would also in turn make the trigger pull extremely heavy. Now, there are likely some missing messages back and forth because apparently a heavier triggered gun was assembled and Chief of Ordnance Buffington wasn't pleased. On October 9th, he directed that the revolver to have the trigger made straighter and shortened if necessary so as to give more leverage, which would make the pull easier. The pull is now so great that Filipinos could not possibly use the revolver with any degree of accuracy. I'm not sure Buffington understood how leverage works, or maybe he just mixed up the words short and long. He was close to retirement at this point anyway. He also ordered contract production halted until this matter could be resolved. Captain Horney started with internal modifications, slightly increasing the mainspring strength from the factory default, changing the shape of the firing pin, and fitting a shorter hammer stirrup. This apparently got the trigger weight down to only 13 pounds 6 ounces. Oh boy. Frank Phipps sent along the improved sample on October 18th, but Buffington found that trigger too heavy as well. Phipps again sent a sample on November 1st, this time with a handmade, longer trigger and trigger guard. This created a trigger pull of only 10 pounds 11 ounces. Oh yeah. Helpfully, they pointed out the maximum allowable weight for the current Service 38 was 12 pounds even, so clearly they were well ahead of the curve. Buffington finally approved the new Colt, and I want to make some contextual information very clear, which I think had a dramatic effect on this decision. Buffington made this call on November 6th and retired on November 22nd. Captain Horney then sent the hand-modified revolver over to Colt's Patent Firearms in order to have machine-made components produced. The first example was then sent back in December, which Horney inspected and then forwarded on to Phipps on December 28th. Phipps passed this on to the new Chief of Ordnance, Brigadier General William Crozier. Hello, darkness, my old friend. Now, Crozier had apparently already seen and handled the handmade prototypes. Observing the new pistol, he was concerned that the trigger was not as straight and the pull seemed heavier somehow. Then he did something very interesting. He approved the design. No further reference of the revolver to this office is deemed necessary. The experience of the armory and the factory should be sufficient to obtain the best possible results. Okie dokie then. 2 more examples were ordered and then production could resume. On January 27th, 1902, Captain Horney sent a letter detailing the exact changes to the new model. The stirrup was shortened, the nose of the hammer left longer and sharper, the mainspring strengthened. Length of trigger was increased, as was the trigger guard to match. Woo-wee, we made it, y'all. Now, I double-checked. I could not find in the limited research I was able to do the exact model designation of this gun, other than just being the double action Colt pistol, double action army, that sort of thing. Later on, probably because of that same confusion, a lot of people would start to call it the Alaskan model because they assumed that the large trigger guard was meant for a gloved hand. This is not the case. The large trigger guard is just there so that you can have a large trigger. Okay? Now, I'm going to say it. I'm going to stick with the collectors on this one and call it the 1878/1902. Let's go ahead and get a closer look. Alright folks, here's our Philippine Model 1902. This is as modified in order to run service ammunition from the period. You may notice that compared to the original 1878, there's something different here. I don't know if you guys have ever played highlights for kids, but if you look at this and you look at that, one of these things is not like the other. Granted, this is in a little nicer shape, although it has been re-blued. This seems to be the original finish, what's left of it. And there's a little bit of difference in our barrels, but other than that, well, you tell me, folks at home, is it here? Is this our clue? That's right, it's a terribly extended trigger and a horribly distended trigger guard. Offensively so. As a matter of fact, you can tell why people thought the only reason to do this was for gloved hands. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Instead, this was done in order to give you enough leverage to work the heinous internal mainspring. If I get here, first of all, look at that angle. I'm way down here to get to the bottom of the trigger, and I don't know how much of a leverage boost that I'm getting because I really can't get low enough to reach the bottom of the trigger anyway. That's why they wanted it straight. This curvature, I don't know what it's doing for me. And if I actually pull that trigger, oh good lord, that is not 12 pounds. That is probably closer to 20 or 25. I mean, this thing is ridiculous. I actually probably should be ordering a trigger scale and getting you guys notes on it later because it is a world of difference between this and this particular gun. I can actually quite comfortably work that action. I'm really not putting a lot of energy into it at all. And on this one, if I get out of position at all, I'm really struggling to contain that. And before Mae does any firing whatsoever, I will say that without having to pay attention to our primers and doing a little bit of adjustment, I was smacking holes in every primer that we ran through this gun. So it is aggressive to say the very least. Now, other differences between this and a regular civilian 1878 are of course the markings. We'll see here at the knuckle and here at the trigger, RAC. That's for Ronaldo A. Carr. That would be our inspector over at the armory. In addition, you'll see on the other side of the knuckle in this corner, JTT, that's for John T. Thompson. Yes, that particular Thompson, as a matter of fact. This is also, in these two positions, is where you might find OCH if it was one of the very, very first ones inspected by Otis Creamer Horney. You'll also see a US mark here under the cylinder, and you'll see 1902 embossed in front of the grip in this position. Alright, well, except for some slight dimensional differences, this is the same gun as last episode mechanically, so let's skip the animation and get it straight into Mae's hands for some, well, hopefully shooting. That's a heavy trigger. Good lord. Oh, okay, back to the history. Fun fact, Horney further advised that as old stocks of ammo were used up, the revolvers could easily be converted back to their commercial configuration. Just swap the mainspring, trigger, and trigger guard. Yeah, they never did that. However, some ordnance-marked trigger guards and even overproduction frames did make it into civilian production, so don't be too surprised if you find an otherwise civilian gun with Inspector Carr's initials. I should also mention that in December of 1903, another sample revolver, apparently of this same configuration, was sent over to Ordnance, and then 50 more followed. These were not marked the same as mine today, apparently only displaying a smaller US property marking, roughly in the same spot as the original. The reason they were ordered or where they were issued is presently unknown. Now, service for this particular arm has proven difficult to track down. The height of the constabulary manpower was in the 1905-06 fiscal year, with 6,967 enlisted men and only 327 officers. So with 5,000 revolvers ordered, these were likely expected to be widely fielded. Also curious is a 1904 Philippine Commission report which lists 34,976 arms in total. It lists 600 Colt 41 caliber double actions. This was the single order for model 1877s we saw in a previous episode, and 5,129 Colt double actions in 45. That's 129 too many. These may have been some unknown lot that sparked the demand for the 78 to begin with, or they may reflect some purchases of the Colt new service ahead of the eventual model 1909. Some period letters and documents seem to suggest only officers were permitted revolvers, whether they be this or another model. And in that regard, we do find photographic evidence of American men clearly carrying the 1902 in the theater. However, we also do occasionally find photos with the 1902 in the hands of enlisted natives or specialty troops, like this bugler who seems to have the familiar round butt and lanyard ring tucked away on his side. Even so, it really seems like the broad majority remain sealed in inventory because further records of maintenance never seem to include more than a couple guns being serviced. At some point, the majority or perhaps all of the 1902s were sold surplus, being purchased by the famed Francis Bannerman, who advertised them in his 1911 catalog as hardly used. Bannerman stated that they were purchased in 1907 due to a new .45 caliber being adopted. But we know that the model 1909 came 2 years after that and a lot closer to the sale date, so maybe this was a simple transcription error of 9 into a 7. Be it 1907 or 1909, that's a very short service life for 5,000 guns in near mint condition, which leads me to a theory. I think that these guys were radioactive. This was a time when US politicians were expected to be fiscally careful. This order was made by Governor Taft, an expensive but necessary component of his plans in the Philippines. However, his request seems to have been sloppy. I honestly believe that we are missing some context on why the 78 was named versus, the other guns. Yes, it could have been a simple sort of short-sightedness, or it may have been some combination of wanting double-action 45 stopping power, but not wanting to pay for the brand new design, or maybe the Army didn't want the Constabulary having a swing-out cylinder quick loader? I don't know. We do know that the Constabulary was stuck with the single-shot Springfields up until the 1903 rifle was adopted, and only once issued would they arm the Constabulary with Krag carbines. Regardless of why, the 1878 was chosen, but the execution went through ordnance, so we have this weird civilian-military authority mix, which is probably why at some point it became not my problem, and the 1902 model was born. Doubtlessly, when it arrived in the Philippines, authorities realized it was frankly awful, but to reject them would mean that either ordnance messed up or the governor messed up, and given the shared responsibility of the islands, I'm betting they chose to confront neither issue and just leave most of them in their boxes, making do with long arms where they could. Which we see almost exclusively in period photos anyway. Revolvers are rarely found. This is, however, just my theory. I'd be very happy to have it proven wrong because that would mean that we found out more hard data on the issue of these pistols. Alright, that's the 1902 in an hour-long nutshell, but we still haven't wrapped the entire history of the 1878 overall. So, commercial sales of, well actually, hold on. This pistol, or some like it, would be somewhat lackluster. For a small or even medium-sized company pushing between 1,500 and 3,000 a year on average made for a pretty good product, but this was Colt's. Sales of the old single-action Army dwarfed the double-action all the way to 1940. And the little 1877, the one with the bad reputation, well, that sold over 3 times as many units as the 78 as well. Sure, there would be some small high notes, the Canadian Order in 1885, a boost in sales during the Spanish-American War, and of course, the 1902 contract, the largest of them. But usually the status quo was maintained through a series of minor commercial emergencies, miners' strikes in the United States, wool shearers' strikes in Australia, anything that would drive competition and men might buy up a few more guns than average, things like that. As we covered last time, more chamberings were added to the 78, but that only seems to have sustained sales, not actually grown them significantly. Fun fact though, discounting the Philippine contract, the 4440 chambering just edged out the 45 Colt in production and popularity. Counting the Philippine contract, obviously 45 won. Following the US contract in 1902, Colt would begin marking the 78s with a smokeless powder proof on the trigger guard, which means that's what the US Army was interested in. I haven't found any evidence that they actually changed the makeup of the gun though. Production seems to have stopped in 1905 with shipments ending in August. Since all of the 1878s were made in one long sequential serial line, we have a fair idea how many were made. 51,210, excepting maybe a few unserialed test or demonstration pieces. That's actually quite a small number for a Colt product. Well, at the very least, the 1878 model, the double-action Army, seems to have given the US commercial market, maybe even a few military authorities, their first taste of a martially sized double-action revolver. Granted, it was kind of a bitter taste. Like the 77, the 78 earned a reputation for light strikes, misfires, which is why they had to go through all of this. This was, of course, though, the majority fault of the ammunition at the time, and the negligent discharges were common, yes, but we eventually learned to keep our fingers off the triggers. That was an important cultural change that was achieved sometime, I believe, in the 1970s. Like we said earlier, inventor William Mason left Colt in 1882, joining up with Winchester. Interestingly, about this same time, Colt had sought out Andrew Burgess, working with him on a rifle to compete with Winchester's line. Mason then revealed a prototype single and double-action revolver under the Winchester brand. This shot across the bow brought both companies into a secret agreement to stay out of each other's product lanes. Mason would then go on to work out the kinks on a variety of Browning designs, holding his position at Winchester until his death in 1913. Frederick von Alpen, the man who pushed for Colt's first double actions, retired for health reasons in October of 1896, passing supposedly in 1920, although biographical data for him is a little questionable after his Colt service. Alright everyone, it took 3 episodes, but I think we finally understand how and why Colt's patent firearms entered the double-action market, and how their least successful model managed to still get some government service in 2.5 decades later. Now, let's go see how Mae felt about this. Well, frankly, I think we're just going to ask about the trigger. Alright, once more we've made room for Mae.
Hello.
And she's getting a little long in the tooth, so fortunately this might be...
Those are dummy rounds.
Yeah, I'm putting in the snap caps now because I already know where this conversation is going to go. So these are inert rounds with rubber backing so that we do not destroy this firing pin, although we may destroy the snap caps, because I want Mae's opinion on the Philippine model.
7802.
Yeah.
So we've just gone from the 78.
Right.
And we've had all of our, well, we've literally just gone from the 78. So we had all our complaints about that one.
You guys have waited 2 weeks, but we literally just finished up a conversation about the 78 where we left on a bit of a cliffhanger because we didn't want to talk about it sort of after its first couple years of service.
Yeah, and we talked about how I didn't care for that gun as far as the weight, the hammer pull was too heavy, trigger pull too heavy, it was uncomfortable for me. So the 02...
She hated it.
Yeah, I did not care for it, and I unfortunately still don't care for it.
Can we just admit that a lot of your hate for the 78 comes from your love for the 77?
It does kind of make it difficult to go from something that fit me so well to something that doesn't. It does kind of color that.
There's an emotional thing there. I'm sorry. I'm going to call you out on this.
Okay, you can.
This, like going from that little 77 to this 78, Mae, I guarantee you, her brain is going, "What'd they do to my boy?"
Yeah. My boy, it was so good. What'd they do to my boy? That actually is kind of it.
Yeah, you're just offended at the 78. You need to let go, Mae.
Now, here's the thing.
And give us a fair evaluation of this excellent gun. Do you understand that this thing was created, and then not, 20...
They didn't sell so well.
24 years later, they decided to finally adopt 5,000 of them. 24, that's a quarter of a century later. It was still so relevant that they made 5,000 for
Such
clear and
desperation, you know. But actually, honestly, interestingly enough, when you first handed me the 7802, I thought, oh, this one looks better. It's going to be in better shape because I'm noticing like it doesn't look quite as roughed up as the 78 did. So I had hopes.
Someone went back and loved on this gun. It's been greased up. It's been re-blued, unfortunately, at some point.
Right.
But it looks like it should have. You know, it's a good blue job.
It looks like it should have. And then I'm looking at... Well, hold up. There is one massive change. That trigger guard and trigger, holy good God, that is massive by comparison.
Now, that will clearly help, though, because that's more leverage. So as long as you have the same mainspring... Oh.
No.
Yeah.
It's not the same at all.
No.
God, I still don't know how I did it.
It's just the half-cock position. You need to start from the bottom.
I know. Hold on. Let me get it all the way forward.
Do that one-handed.
God, I still don't know how I did it as smoothly on range that day.
I want to point out something, though. As much as she's grimacing, remember, last episode, we surprised you guys by saying that we will be covering the Enfield Mark I.
Right, we did.
The ergonomics of the gun were such that she could not one-hand that hammer. You had to two-hand the hammer on that gun.
That is true.
As horrible as it is,
I am still able to at least reach the hammer. That is fair. And again, snap caps are in here, so let's try the actual trigger pull.
That looked accurate.
I'm still shaking with that. And I've actually been training up my hands so that I could hopefully handle stuff like this better.
I'm going to tell you.
It's still too much.
We backed the screw out some for filming.
Just a little bit.
No, we backed out some. The problem is you could take it all the way out and it's still heavier by far than this guy at full tension.
It is a nightmare and a half.
But we actually had to. We actually wanted to make Mae shoot at full tension on the hammer. But as you recall, when we went to actually test the ammunition, we were blowing smoke out the backside of the revolver because it was just...
It was punching holes all the way through. There was no hope for the primers.
Those poor primers stood...
They were just gone. They were just instantly destroyed.
It's hot gas in your face.
Yeah, that was fun. I was like, I don't think it should be doing this. And you're like, no, I don't think so either. So we did have to find a sweeter spot to where I had the most comparable amount of poundage still there. And also, it wasn't blowing the primers to pieces.
They were trying to blow their way into the actual case proper. Like, I mean, it was smacking the crap. I've never seen anything hit a primer that hard before.
I still haven't either. Yeah.
Oh my God, I was impressed. I don't know how. I'd love to get a hold of, like, some of the original Philippine style of ammo, the surplus. Because I really want to know how hard that stuff was.
Just to see how it stood up to it.
Just
yeah, I'd be
solid
curious.
iron primers that you spark to ignite,
I still think it probably punched it out. This is some pretty impactful weight behind that drop.
We have so skipped the ergonomics, though.
Well, it's all pretty identical to the 7802. We still have the same gate and loading and unloading operation with the spring set ejector.
Yeah. Don't bother listing. Let's be honest.
Oh, right.
It's just the trigger and trigger guard.
Well, yeah,
That's it.
It's all, you can look right there. That's pretty much it.
Technically, this one has a 1/2 inch longer barrel because they ordered them in 6-inch. They didn't
that's right. It does.
They didn't even order them in like a standard barrel length. They made them in 6-inch for some reason.
Right.
So it has a slightly longer barrel. And then that trigger and trigger guard.
Yeah, and then the weight difference, obviously.
Now, do me a favor with that trigger because I have a theory. Go ahead and hold that like you're going to shoot it.
Okay.
Now, take note of how low your finger is.
Right.
Hold it up for this camera over here, right? See where her finger is? That's because of the curvature of the trigger. May I have that gun, please? Pick up the other one. See where her finger is? It's not giving you a lot of different... That is the most baffling thing about this, is that it barely opens up your finger for more leverage. And then in doing so, it tucks your finger so far down low. I'm not kidding when I say that in the ordnance reports we saw, they were like, hey, what happened to the straight trigger?
Oh, yeah, because people were just like, they missed it.
I really wish I could get, I don't want to ruin one, and that's pretty much the only way. But
Yeah.
I'd love to get one that I can install a straight trigger on and see if it actually helped, because I feel like if this just went straight down and I could actually reach the bottom of this horrible trigger guard.
That would actually help. It really would. You'd have a little more leverage access,
Right.
and I think it'd work out better overall.
But the way it's shaped right now, I'm almost where I was before. I really don't understand it. I mean,
honestly, I feel like I'm having to reach further forward. Like, I don't feel like I'm quite reaching the same depth as I was on the 78. I think I'm actually reaching further forward, which does not feel any more comfortable. That's worse.
It's very bizarre to me. It feels like the trigger is like a quarter of its length is wasted by the way it's curled so far forward.
I don't understand why the curl was going to be the thing that would help with it. It doesn't seem like it actually would.
I suspect it's there because of some principles about not allowing things to get caught in there and the way it doesn't get snugged up by holster gunk and other BS, right?
And I guess
it has to have that tapered surface, because if you try to pull it back and something's gotten in here and it doesn't have that tapering surface, it's not going to be able to sort of squeeze or roll it out of the way, whatever it is.
And then honestly, if you have it straight, there is the possibility that depending on how far back that pull is, you could accidentally get your finger down between the trigger and pinch it.
Yeah.
With the weight with that guy, that would suck.
But at the same time, if you just knew, even if there's just a nubbin, now this isn't for defense use, but if there's just some nubbin as an experiment so that I could actually get down there and maybe not pinch my finger but still feel the straight trigger, I'd love to feel it.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to try.
Something happened there that is not in the books. And that something is somebody got a blister, I'm sure of it. Like somebody got pinched real bad.
Yeah.
But then you end up with these dimensions that still don't make a lot of sense.
And that ergonomically just are not comfortable for the shooter.
Honestly, handling this gun, I'm really like, I've read some of the older books that people were writing about these in the 50s, and they would say it was the Alaskan model for gloved hands.
I mean, I could see it. Like, if you think of things like the Nambu or stuff like that, where they see the larger trigger guard, they're like, oh yeah, obviously there needs to be a...
Yeah, Japanese did it, we must have done it too at some point. And I don't blame them for making that assumption.
No.
Because this doesn't make any sense. I mean, it really does. I mean, even with the ammo problem, this just does not make any.
Although I suppose all you'd have to do is really look at where the trigger actually rests. Getting a glove finger in this tiny little opening right here does not seem that easy to do.
No. All right, so here's your question then.
Oh, God.
You're in the Philippines.
Okay.
You can have this, or you can have a single action army artillery model, so the one with the shortened barrel.
Yeah. It's single action only.
Yeah, but you can cock and shoot it.
I mean, I can just back this screw out and then I can cock and shoot this one.
No, it won't go bang.
Oh, right. It's got to be able to punch the primer hard enough.
Can you try that trigger one more time?
I'm probably still stuck with this one.
We still got the snap caps in there. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Hurry, danger, go. Do you think you hit it?
Maybe. I mean, I can still... Even if I'm having to shoot it fast, I can still nail the target.
Are you about to tell me you take it over a single action army?
I mean, again, I still don't think there's a comparison between the two because it's single action only.
You heard it from Mae. Ordnance did a good job.
No, I'm saying that you have no choice.
Mae's commitment to double action is unlimited.
No matter how depressing it is.
You sure you want to just learn to fan the hammer instead of just dealing with that?
I mean, you could get pretty quick with that, but then again, in an emergency situation, which one is going to be more easily doable by your average soldier?
On the plus side, in an emergency situation, you would never shoot yourself in the leg with that gun.
This is true.
It'd
be really hard.
You could quite intentionally draw that gun by its trigger.
Yeah, you really could, actually. You just rest it there at all times.
If you ND with a 1902...
You tried.
You tried.
You tried. You tried to ND. Good job. And you did it.
All right.
But that's pretty much it in a nutshell.
1902 aside, we were going to tell people how we felt about the 78 overall. So I take it you prefer the original 78?
In between the two, yes.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to give you this. Here you go.
Okay.
Now, how do you feel about it?
What do you mean?
Just in general, do you feel like it was a good gun or a bad gun? Or do you...
I mean, I still don't have a difference in my opinion from previously. I still don't find it a great gun. Now, if I'm having to compare the two of them, it's better than the 02, like I said.
So narrow use case for a limited amount of time.
Exactly. It quickly, like you mentioned, does become obsolete.
Right.
sorry, but it's only good for the short period it was good for, and it was not good for the period that it was used in.
Well, at least it was influential. It really introduced the U.S. market to double actions. That and the 77 really did help us kind of clean up our primer game in the U.S., making the ammo more acceptable for oncoming double actions. It was a road paver.
Fair.
And I will say there's still something pretty cool about it. Like, I actually wouldn't mind it. I don't have money to spend.
Right.
But if I was sort of a guy out in the frontier or something, and I had like a Winchester 1892 in 4440, and then I was told I can get this in 4440, and it's quick and easy to get at and double action. So you got a bear coming, and you just want and boom.
Pretty good bear stopper, I would say.
Right. That's what I'm saying. Like, it's not a bad. There's some thought there where, especially in the American market, there's a lot more reason to have something that can take the same cartridge as, say, a pistol caliber carbine.
Right. All you have is one ammo on you, one type. You don't have to worry about changing it up.
Carry a bunch of 4440.
I totally get that.
Yeah. And then, if you really need a carbine or rifle, you have, it's not as wasteful to have that ammunition set aside. But, yeah, I don't know. There's something that's very romantic about it. And
romantic?
Yeah. Like Old West romance.
Okay.
You've never been in love with the Old West, ever. I guess you didn't grow up as a boy, but
No, I didn't grow up as a boy.
You don't like cowboys.
I learned I learned about Bonanza much later on in my years, and I was like, oh, I love Bonanza. That's great. Until they lose Hal. That last season was not acceptable. Haas, thank you. Why did I say Hal?
I don't know why you said
knocked him in the middle the other day, I guess.
So, it still feels like a cowboy gun to me. The handle's weird, but it feels like a cowboy gun. It does cowboy things, but it's more modern. And to be fair, a lot of the Western dramas that we deal with are actually set in like the 1890s or even on into 1900, which this would have been around plenty for.
Sure.
And yet we still sort of see Hollywood stuck on the single action army, and we only see the single action army, but there's a lot of colorful guns out there in the Old West.
I would be interested to see this in one of the actual cowboy movies. I haven't really seen one floating around.
Well, interesting fact, actually, while we're on that, you can find a lot of these marked by, I believe it's Western Costume Company. Don't hold me to that. I believe it's WCC.
Okay.
But you may actually see a number of the 1902 specifically, because so many of them came over in good shape and could be bought in a lot. One of the Western prop companies bought up a bunch of them, marked them as their own property, and would use them for background characters in Westerns.
Oh, neat.
And so you may actually see a lot of 1902s in the backgrounds of Westerns.
Where would they mark the potential?
Oh, on the side of the frame. I honestly don't recall now that I'm thinking about it, because it wasn't part of our military history, so I tend to not get too deep into the commercial. I'm sorry. Now everybody's
cool.
excited about the
if anyone has one, and take a look for the marking potentially.
It's very big. You will see it.
Oh.
But when you held them, if you're an extra and you hold this and you're not paying too much attention, you're just in the background, this much just looks cowboy gun.
Ah, I could see that.
All right. Well, is there anything else that you want to say about the 78s?
Fantastic to be able to try the whole family. I'm glad that we were able to get all three in the studio at once so that we could actually test it out. Thank you again, Tom, for the lend.
Yeah. Also, I'm going to load up 150 rounds of this.
Nope.
So that you can shoot it.
Nope.
For all you want. We'll do a marathon shoot. It'll be a live event, and we'll all cheer Mae on for each round.
Just extra loads for the 77, and I'll be good with that.
I wonder how much we can make if we just did a live event where we just, for every however many dollars that came in, you had to pull the trigger again.
God, don't even. I hate that so much.
All right. Y'all have a good one.
Bye, everybody. All right, everybody. I'm going to keep this update short and sweet. Congratulations to Rob from British Muzzleloaders for winning the Most Dapper Award in this year's Gundies. Thank you everyone for supporting us and him in this crazy dream of ours to make sure the right man, the right muzzle cover, rightfully won.